Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. As promised, the second session that I did at the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario conference back in early December. This one is, unlike the one I posted yesterday on large-scale no-till, this one is on small-scale no-till, and it features Daniel Mays of Frith Farm, Ryan and Isabel of Field Good Farms, and Christine of Persephone Market Gardens. Super awesome conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you to the EFAO for letting us post it. And this video was made possible in part by a grant from Southern SARE. Hope you enjoy. So here it is, the EFAO small scale no-till vegetable session. Let's do it.
So welcome everyone. I think we'll get started here. I want to welcome you to this session on no-till vegetable farming and small-scale vegetable farms. I just want to let everyone know that we will be recording this session and it will be shared later after the conference. My name is Dylan Muldoon. I'm the Research and Soil Health Program Coordinator at the EFAO, and I'm joined today by my wonderful co-host and tech support wizard, Cassie Weaver, our Events and Resources Manager, who will be helping us out behind the scenes. While we're not all gathered in one place for this year's conference, I would like to acknowledge that I'm currently living and working in Thunder Bay on the northern shores of Lake Superior and the lands of the Fort Williams First Nation, signatory to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850 and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Métis people. EFAO's work ranges across unceded territories and 46 recognized treaties. Land acknowledgements are just the very start of the process of reconciliation, and to continue this most essential work, we invite you to consider these questions on the screen. We also encourage you to learn about the history of the land that you're in relationship with by visiting www.whos.land and nativeland.ca, which Cassie will drop in the chat. You're invited to read EFAO's land acknowledgement and learn about what actions EFAO is taking in terms of anti-racism, equality, and reconciliation at efao.ca/land acknowledgement and efao.ca/anti-racism and farming, which Cassie will also drop in the chat. Please reach out if you have any thoughts or feedback for the EFAO. The EFAO staff and board are very interested in learning together and taking concrete action. A thank you to the conference supporting partners, the Canadian Organic Growers, Regeneration Canada, the Carrot Catch, Local Food and Farm Co-op Network, the National Farmers Union Ontario, the Ontario Soils Network, the Organic Council of Ontario, the Fair Finance Fund, and the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security. We are very grateful for the support of these inspirational organizations who are contributing to the conference sessions and who have helped us promote this conference throughout their networks. Thank you to all of our conference sponsors who have provided financial support for this year's conference, as well as contributing towards conference bursaries. Without these contributions, this conference would be impossible. There are opportunities to meet and chat with these sponsors, as well as partner organizations listed on the previous slides during the lunch and evening socials on the Wander platform that we're using. Please check out the conference website to see which particular sponsors and partners are available on the platform. These businesses and organizations provide really valuable services and products to the ecological farming community, and I encourage you to connect with them during the conference. I would also like to thank the following foundations for their generous and continued support of the EFAO. These foundations are not only supporting this year's conference, but also support EFAO's ongoing programs and operations throughout the year. A big thank you to the Brian and Joanna Lawson Family Foundation, the Weston Foundation, the T.R. Megan Family Foundation, and the Robert and Morris Sampson's Ideas Foundation, a project within the London Community Foundation. here are some ways that you can engage during the session. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You can choose to have your video on or off. You can choose to have your video on or off. I would ask you to stay muted when you're not speaking to avoid the background noise in the session. If you'd like to ask a question, there are two ways you can do this. First, you can use the chat function and drop it in any questions in there towards me or Cassie if you want them to be anonymous, or just to everyone if you're okay with them being asked out loud. The second way you can do this is by raising your hand and asking a question on the video or audio feed. And to do this, please click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to remind you that we're recording this session and we'll send the session out after the conference. At all EFAO events, we cultivate a learning-oriented community and a culture of kind, patient, respectful openness, curiosity, and inclusion. Our EFAO community agreement provides us with concrete ways to put these values into practice and to support us through challenges or conflict to create greater resilience and connection. By attending the conference, you agree to abide by these agreements and co-create a positive space positive and learning-oriented space. Please reach out if you have any concerns or ideas on how we can do this better. I'm very excited to welcome you once again to our session on no-till vegetable farming for small-scale vegetable farms. I see that we have about 93 participants so far today, and I want to welcome all of you. Again, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and where you're coming from. And now I'm pleased to introduce to you our moderator, Jesse Frost. Please take it away, Jesse.
So thank you to Dylan, thank you to Cassie, thank you to everyone at the EFAO. You all have put on an amazing conference, and I'm excited to be doing this particular session on small scale no-till. As I said, my name is Jesse. I will be the moderator today. I host the No-Till Market Garden podcast, and I co-run Rough Draft Farmstead with my wife, Hannah, in Central Kentucky. I also co-founded NoTillGrowers.com with my partner, Jackson Roulette, where we create various forms of media from podcasts to videos, etc. I'm also the author of the Living Soil Handbook, and I am very excited to be hosting. Before we dive into the nerdy stuff, I want to take a moment to introduce each of our panel. First is Isabel Spence-Legault and Ryan Spence of Field Good Farms in Northeastern Ontario. Ryan has been living and farming in Northeastern Ontario for 11 years. His interests are in increasing biodiversity, conservation, soil amelioration, meaningful leadership, and living joyfully. Isabel has been farming for 7 years alongside Ryan. Isabel's interest in farming started with an eco internship in Montreal, where she helped establish a collective garden in an impoverished neighborhood and worked for Cyclo Nord Sud to collect and send bicycles to developing countries. After this experience, Isabel completed a 6-month internship at Dayloo Farms, where she learned about CSAs, egg shares, and pastured livestock production. Very cool. Excited to hear about your farm. Welcome, Isabel and Ryan.
Thanks,
Great.
Jesse.
Thank you, Jesse.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And a pleasure to have you. We also have Christine Hamill of Persephone Market Garden. Christine lives at the base of Saugeen Peninsula on the traditional land of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. She farms with her husband and 3 children, growing vegetables and herbs, a small flock of sheep, and various poultry, along with lots of nut trees. Her focus is on fostering collaboration and relationships in the garden and beyond it. Very cool, Christine. Excited to hear about your work today. Welcome.
Hello.
And we are also joined by Daniel Mays of Frith Farm in Southern Maine. Daniel has been growing vegetables commercially using no-till methods since 2011. His Waldorf education and Quaker upbringing shape his relationship to land and community, and their influences can be seen in Frith Farm's commitment to soil health, biodiversity, human scale practices, and on-farm education. Daniel holds a master's degree in environmental engineering, is the author of the No-Till Organic Vegetable Farm, which if I may editorialize for a second, is absolutely excellent. And he enjoys discussing regenerative farming systems with anyone who grows food. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
and this is going to be a lot of fun. So we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. What I'm going to do is have each of you describe your sort of no-till regenerative systems. But before you do, since context is sort of everything in farming, maybe start by giving a brief description of the kind of acreage you're working on, and maybe even the soil type, and then give us an overview of the methods you use to manage your acreage. So maybe we can start with Ryan and Isabel.
Sure, sounds good, Jesse. So we're in northeastern Ontario. Anyone who's from Ontario, we're somewhere situated between North Bay and Sudbury along that Highway 17 corridor. That places us in a zone 3B. And while it's not common, it can get down to minus 40 degrees Celsius over the winter. The last few years, I can't think of, I think the last time that happened was like 7 or 8 years ago, but it can get quite cold, and that really limits some of the perennial crops we can grow, which is minus 35 Fahrenheit, I believe. So that gives us about 115 to 120 days frost free. This year was a bit of an anomaly, but generally speaking, that's how much we have as a frost-free growing season. We have a silt loam soil. Traditionally, this would have been the bottom of an ancient lake. So it's beautiful soil to grow vegetable crops into. We do have areas that are more heavy in clay, but that's sort of the layout. Definitely no sand and very little rock. It's very flat and open. Thanks, Saskatchewan. When the settlers came in, they took a lot of the trees down. So there is a very strong dominant northwest wind that comes in. Very few trees to block that. And so we run a 4-season CSA market garden. And then we also sell wholesale to an online farmers market called ClickFork. And we grow about 50 to 60 different crops any given year, plus or minus. And we have 4 acres being worked. Now it's split between acres that we till and acres that we either do low till or no till. Within those 4 acres, 2 are tilled, and we have crops that are going in that are about 75 to 100 days to maturity. About 1 1/3 are in vegetables, and then 2/3 of them are always in cover crops, so we can do a rotation of those. And the ones that are being grown in those systems are winter squash, or alliums like the garlic, and the storage onions, and then potatoes, and then the carrot, parsnips, and then, like I mentioned, the cover crops. So those are tilled acres, and then 1.25 of that is in no-till. And out of that 0.25, so a quarter acre, is under plastic. And so those are unheated structures, so tunnels. We always call them greenhouses, but I know technically those would be heated, and these are not. So they allow us to do early and late greens, tomatoes, ground cherries, peppers, eggplant, and cucumbers. That also includes 2 caterpillar tunnels, I should say. So obviously not inflated poly situation. It's just like a straight up plastic that we have to take down every winter, so the snow load doesn't bury them. And then, so that gives us basically the layout of our farm, and I can show you a picture of what that looks like in a second. And then we also do perennials, and we're trying to move towards that direction more and more. So the reason being that we're trying to grow adapted plants so that we have less of an issue with climate change. Is a bit of mitigation that we're trying to do. And I've been doing teas for a while, but now we're trying to do teas a little bit more intensively, where we grow crops that might, resemble something that's already growing on the property, but could be commercialized. So that includes fruits like haskap, sea buckthorn, raspberries, and sour cherries. And then the teas are goldenrod, yarrow, mint, lemon balm, raspberry. The sea buckthorn is also great for that as well, and roses.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
We skipped over a tiny little bit. And
that's why we're 2 people.
in the field, we have about an acre of no-till veggies.
That's right.
And those are generally 30 to 60 days to maturity crops. So it's The stuff that's in tilled, it's everything else. So brassicas, greens, beets, scallions, fresh onions, carrots. Like we do some carrots in our no-till gardens. All the legumes, nightshades, summer squash, those things.
And that's the part of the garden where I don't want Elliot Coleman to come in and look at, because we were huge proponents of crop rotation for a really long time. But these no-till sections are just like a plethora of all kinds of family groups coming together and having a great big party. And then in terms of our no-till methods, we have a 30-inch bed system. And we use amendments when we need. So we do our soil tests diligently every fall to find out if we have to amend. And it's the usual suspects, like, I mean, we've had to amend for boron and that sort of thing, but very little else. And then we broad fork as necessary, usually in the tunnels. I'm sure anyone who's done production under plastic knows that that soil can get a little bit more compacted. And then we use compost most of the time using a tractor. The implement that we use is similar. If you've seen the session before this with Ken Lang, our compost applicators works almost exactly the same way as Ken's does. We've had to do some changes to it so that it applies a thicker layer, obviously. And then in the covered structures, we use a wheelbarrow instead, and a good old fashioned shovel. We are doing small scale now. And then we do have a 30-inch landscape rake that we use to smooth out beds. We do have a tilther that we will use as necessary. In the previous session, if you were there, you noticed people were talking a little bit about issues with germination. Whenever we do use the tilther, it's really just for things that are really small seeded, like baby greens. And then we transplant with trowels. We can also direct seed. We use a Yang or Earthway. And we also use a paper pot transplanter in our no-till systems. We usually weed about once for crops that are longer than 30 days to maturity. Otherwise, we normally don't have to. So when we take off that crop residue, we'll be taking off the weeds at the same time. And then we do all of that removing of crop detritus by hand. We were really inspired by the Singing Frogs model. So a lot of this will be something that we learned from them at a previous EFAO conference a number of years ago. And we found that this works really well in our context in Northeastern Ontario. So we use things like loppers, pruners, knives, hoes to cut the crop detritus. And we do also use a brush hog when it's a larger section that we're dealing. And then we move that detritus to compost. We aren't in a situation where we're like in the Pacific area where there's a lot of humidity in the air. So we do find that bringing that detritus to the compost is necessary for a system. And then we will either replant with a crop or a cover crop. And we use the Yang or Earthway to do our cover crop seeding because they're smaller sections, I guess. And then the Earthway, we also have, I'm sure you've seen this, but we've actually put 3 Earthways together so that we can seed more efficiently. And then sometimes we'll do like a 6-row system with that. And then because of our context, a lot of our cover crops are sort of coming after a main season crop. And so they'll actually terminate with the winter. So we're lucky enough to not have to do too much crop termination using aggressive methods. And then we also sometimes cover with silage tarps, especially when we're doing transitions between till systems or fields and into no-till production. And then Ryan, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about the details.
I think that's good. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we could jump back to and get more details on some of the technical stuff in a minute.
Sure.
That was great though. There's so many good things that we can touch on. Christine, do you want to do the same thing? Do you want to kind of give us an idea of your context and maybe a little bit of overview of the kind of methods you're using?
Sure. So I'm at the base of the Saugeen Peninsula in southern Ontario. I think that's about a zone 5, so quite a bit warmer than you folks up there. But I am about 2 to 3 hours away from all the major urban centers of southern Ontario. And with 3 little kids, I decided right off the bat that I couldn't fathom the idea of trying to market to any of those bigger places. So I market all my stuff within about 30 kilometers of the farm, which means that I have a fairly limited market, and that's in the end actually one of my biggest challenges. And I see the fallout from that sometimes in the field in terms of product isn't moving fast enough. So we have 100 acres. Most of it is actually forest and swamp in various states of regeneration. I think almost the entire farm was cleared about 150 years ago, including the very steep drumlins that run across the farm, which means that the soil eroded from the top of those drumlins and is now down in the bottom where I grow my vegetables. So I have a fairly heavy clayey, loamy soil for the most part in my market garden. The market garden itself is just 1.5 acres, and it's divided into 6 blocks that are very uniform. There's a lot of chaos in life anyway, and so all my blocks are very standardized. So I have 1 length of row cover, 1 length of irrigation, and all that kind of stuff to deal with. So I have 6 blocks. They're 1/4 acre each. They're 100 feet by 100 feet. So I have 20 beds on 5-foot centers that are 100 feet long, which makes planning much easier. And also equipment is really easy to manage. So it's a fairly small operation. My husband supports me, but he isn't involved in the day-to-day operation of the market garden. So both the management and most of the doing is on me, along with 1 to 3 seasonal staff. We also have 3 little kids that are about 3, 6, and 9 years old. So I have been growing the garden and the farm while having little kids, which is why I've really focused on keeping things as simple, lean, as possible. And at the same time, I grow, like most market gardeners with CSAs, 40 to 50 different crops. So that isn't so simple, but that's just the reality. Like Isabel and Ryan, I think we probably attended the same session at the EFAO conference from Elizabeth and Paul Kaiser a few years ago. And I'd had 3 really, really miserable growing seasons before attending that session. We'd had a year of extreme drought. Then we had a year of extreme rain. We had standing water at the beginning of July in my fields, and standing water in areas where I don't necessarily even have standing water in spring. And then the following year, it started really dry and then went really wet. And so everything that I was doing wasn't working anymore. And so I attended that session really primed and ready to hear something different, and just decided to jump right in. So basically after that, with few exceptions, I've completely parked the tractor that I used to use to cultivate the fields in spring and fall. And I've also basically, for the most part, parked my BCS. It's now primarily used as a mower, as a flail mow stuff, but really only use it for one thing once a season for one afternoon. I am definitely in the snow belt. We're just on the inland from Lake Huron. So whenever there's some cold air coming across the lake in winter, we get a lot of snow, about 12 feet on average. So besides not having a huge amount of management capacity, plus having a lot of snow and very little sunshine in winter, I've never been particularly inclined to try to do winter growing or to have any hoop houses. So at this point, all my production is in the field and it's uncovered. I have used mini caterpillars for peppers in the past. I didn't use that this past year, but it's all unprotected growing because that's what's worked for me so far. Yeah, I think that's it for me in terms of the context.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And for the listeners, the farm that they were referring to earlier that did the EFAO talk is Singing Frogs Farm. They've done there's a lot of videos and such online. Elizabeth and Paul Kaiser, they're excellent. And then the model of the, I'm not sure what the exact model of the compost spreader that Isabel had mentioned earlier, but when they post that session, if you missed it, you can, there's a video, he talks about it, Ken does, and it's a Lancaster, I think, but I'm not sure exactly what the model is. And it basically is just a compost spreader that drops the compost directly down. I forgot to mention that after Isabel. But Daniel, do you want to do the same thing for us? Give us a little context and overview.
Sure. Yeah. It's fun to hear all the similarities. I am Daniel Mays. Excuse me. I run Frith Farm, located in southern Maine, just south of Portland. We're in a frost pocket, so we're actually zone 4B. So kind of nice spread of 3, 4, 5 here. We have very sandy soil. It's actually a loamy sand. So drought prone in the summer, but because we're in a low spot, it's flood prone in the spring. The seasonal high water table comes right up to the surface. So kind of have the best of both worlds there. But it's otherwise good soil. And yeah, we grow 3 acres of no-till vegetables. We grow very intensively. Our revenue from those 3 acres is over $300,000 a year. And we have some high tunnels. We sell to CSA. We have 250 member CSA. That's about half the produce. The other half goes to 3 natural fruit stores and 1 on-farm market. We grow primarily 3 season, but we do a lot of storage crops for the winter and a little bit of greens indoors, but mostly I try to take a rest in the winter so that we can work that much harder in the growing season. I have a crew of 8 full-time people who all live on the farm seasonally, April through November. And that's what enables us to produce so much from so little space. Yeah, I think, oh yeah, we are, permanent raised bed system. My mantra is never see the soil. So we keep the soil fully covered at all times. And this makes weeding pretty much non-existent or very, very minimal. We still get some, but pull those by hand, and it just, see really good results from that in terms of soil health and productivity. Our beds are 42 inches, so 5 feet on center, a little wider than the, Jean Martin 30-inch bed. I prefer that for just more versatility in spacing and interplantings. And yeah, hedgerows, a standardized system of plots. So all of our beds are 100 feet long. Plots are 12 beds. That all, helps keep things really organized and efficient. Yeah, I'm sure we'll get more into everything, but that's good for now, I think.
Yeah, that's great. And definitely another vote for standardization is always great. Okay, so I'm kind of hoping that each one of you can share detail a no or low till strategy that's been effective for you, but may also become somewhat unique to your farm or your context. I know that Isabel was saying you all can plant cover crops, and those you have the winter, and that's kind of something that you get to use that maybe other regions don't. But I'm curious if there's 1 or 2 no or low till strategies that you'd be interested in detailing. We can start again back up at the top with you, Isabel and Ryan.
Yeah, so I think all kinds of things come to mind. I don't know if they're unique to our farm, but I'll go through them nonetheless. So the compost spreader that Isabel mentioned, I think a lot of farms have tried to come up with something, but for us, it was really important because we're using so much compost to get something that can go quickly. So we just modified it was Mill Creek was the company. They're actually pretty cheap, and it just happened to be something that was available locally. If I were to do it again, I'd actually buy something from ABI or the company Lancaster that Ken mentioned.
Out of Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So it's a 53 cubic foot spreader, and we just modified it because it's ground drive. We modified it to speed up the amount that's dropping. So we don't have any control, but we tripled the ground speed drop by changing the gearing on it. But we bought it because the dimensions were perfect. It was cheap, and it was close by. That's the other thing, because we're kind of far from a lot of farming related stuff. There's lots of mining here, but not too much farming. So that was one thing. And then also I really struggled with removing baby greens. We seed with the 12 or the 6 row seeder, and we do it pass one way and then back. So it's 12 rows for for baby greens and mustard mixes and things like that, and trying to remove that detritus after they've been harvested. It just never seemed to work with a hoe. And if I wanted a clean bed after, it was problematic. So the best thing that I could come up with, because we're trying to plant, we're always just trying to take a crop out and plant right away into that area as much as possible. So the best I could come up with was to have row covers on hand, put them on the adjacent beds, and then we just have a 4-stroke Honda weed whacker that I can just run right at the soil surface level, blows that stuff. You don't get all the garbage on the crops next to it. And I can really turn a bed over way faster that way and not worried about the stuff flying everywhere, because that way I can get right down to soil level and it's basically ready to go after doing that.
But if you were to do like a really, really small scale, you'd probably cut it down really low. I think that's the name of the game, and that's what we really got from Singing Frogs, is like when you're terminating. And I did see someone talk about, like, do you ever have, when you're cutting at soil surface, do you ever have things that you get caught up on, crop residue that you get caught up on rather? And you do, obviously you do, but you just have to work around it, is what we found. A lot of what no-till has been for us is a bit of a workaround, but we've seen huge improvements in our soil structure, and our no-till garden has quickly become our favorite garden. And once you just change your mindset about how to manage it, it actually isn't very cumbersome. There are things that I'm starting to see issues pop up, and it mostly has to do with stuff under plastic production. The stuff in the field I'm not so concerned about. We did see for the first time this year, I had sunflowers as like it was an intercrop of a few different things, but sunflowers were one of them. And they actually blew over because of that beautiful little taproot and the fact that the soil is getting a little fluffy. So I guess that's going to be a new challenge, but yeah, no, it's definitely been amazing for us.
I love that little tidbit about the weed whacker flip by putting the row cover over top of the next bed to keep it, especially if you have something like baby greens, because the thing about the weed whacker can be very effective, but it can also sling stuff everywhere. So if you're doing that, to have something to protect your other greens, it's very clever. Christine, do you have anything it doesn't necessarily have to be unique to your farm. I feel like that's a good thing to mention there, but something that you're doing that's been working for you or effective?
One thing that I've really enjoyed, and I was doing already before I went no-till, and have just gotten more convinced of over the years, is the use of lots of straw as mulch. So I'm kind of fortunate. Initially, I just got straw from neighboring farmers, but I now connected with somebody who's a bit further away, but still within sort of a reasonable driving distance, and he grows switchgrass. So it's a perennial grass, and he harvests that in spring. And then I can get it just when I need it to start putting on the garden. And I use it very generously to mulch throughout the garden. I give priority to all the crops that are in for a longer period of time. So anything really more than 2 months. So any more full season crops. So it doesn't go on lettuce beds, for example, but most other crops that are in for a longer time in the garden are mulched quite thickly. And that's usually a week or two after they're planted, so that they're tall enough that I can get a nice thick mulch layer on them. And what I really like about mulching is that it's not a single purpose thing that you do to fight one particular problem. I really don't like doing things where I'm fighting one problem, and mulching to me it's a really multi-purpose thing. So it's a weed management tool for sure. It's also a core part of my disease management for my tomatoes, because I mulch them thickly so I don't get soil splash on them, and have, knock on wood, more than 10 years now not had any significant fungal problems on my tomatoes. And I think the straw mulch is definitely part of that. Plus, it helps retain moisture. So if I have a really dry year, anything that's mulched is going to be in much better shape than not. And at the same time, if I have a really wet year, it's also protected. So I think the mulching with straw for me has been a really helpful practice, and it has so many benefits and is useful in so many ways that when I and my crew are doing it, it just seems like we're accomplishing a lot of goals at the same time. Whereas if we're weeding, you're just kind of, accomplishing one thing. But with mulching, there's a lot that's happening at the same time. So I think that's one of my favorite practices in the garden.
Yeah, that's excellent. I wonder what's the switchgrass for? I know that people use it for energy. I think that it was bred for.
Yeah,
they were using it for
I think
energy
that's,
production. Okay.
Partially why Urs had started growing the switchgrass. I guess he's a bit experimental and adventurous as well. I think at this point he sells the majority of it actually to dairy farmers as bedding, even though I think at the beginning it was more about biomass production and energy. So he sells it in much larger quantities at one time to large dairy farmers, but every year brings me a load, I think, because he finds what I'm doing kind of neat and different, and so likes to see and support that.
I love that. That's one of those beautiful contextual things where that's something that you have in your region, your area, that other people may not have access to. But yeah, Daniel, maybe you could jump in and offer something to that effect.
Sure. Yeah. I really, resonate with that. Trying to do practices that are like working our way up the spiral instead of sort of a downward spiral of, like killing weeds, for instance, feels like a sort of, we're killing weeds, but we're also like hurting the soil and decreasing photosynthesis and all these other things. So yeah, mulching is a big, we do a lot of mulching, straw, leaves, bark mulch, wood chips, compost. So that's sort of our base level, always keeping the soil covered. But then over the last 5 years or so, really tried to do a lot more cover cropping and integrating that into a market garden, no-till, human-powered context has been really fun and some challenges, but really rewarding as well. Just really seeing the vitality of the soil respond to that. Growing vegetables is good for the soil, but growing cover crops is feeding the soil much more. There's just so much more biomass production above and below ground. So yeah, a lot of overwintered rye at this point, which we then crimp down by hand, tarp for a little bit to make sure it's fully dead, and then plant right through that grown in place mulch. And I really like that system for growing the mulch in place and getting like photosynthesis all winter when otherwise the beds would just be sitting empty.
Can you describe that crimping for those, you mentioned crimping it by hand, but a lot of people think of roller crimpers, they think of, large contraptions, but can you kind of describe your method for doing that?
Totally. Yeah. So we are pretty much human powered. So we just have two people stepping on a board, which has a T-post fastened underneath it. So we use that sort of edge of the T as the crimping blade, because it's sort of a dull blade. So that is kind of perfect. And then we just have ropes tied to the board and they're fastened to people's feet. So, it's a good teamwork activity too, because you got to stomp in unison roughly every foot going down the bed. So 100 stomps on a bed, and then we go like a typewriter. So we'll go down a bed and then walk back and crimp this so that all the beds are crimped in the same direction, so that when we pull the tarp on, it's not snagging on any of the rye. And then leave the tarp on for anywhere from a few days if it's really hot and sunny to maybe 10 days if it's not. And then we pull that off and it's like this beautiful golden straw, all oriented in one direction. So then we plant right through that. We only do crops that can be transplanted with somewhat wide spacing into that, because it does take longer to plant into.
That's great. I think that, I wonder if that leads into kind of the next thing that I wanted to talk about, was challenges with no-till. So maybe we'll go the opposite direction and start back with you, Daniel. And have there been challenges with that within that system that you found? You mentioned that you're just doing transplanting, maybe seeding is a challenge, direct seeding would be a challenge. Are there challenges there? And then like, is there anything that you've tried that has been shown hope that you could, maybe break through that challenge? And any thoughts on that?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, rye, like all the reasons people hate it is why it's so great. It just produces so much biomass and such just dense root mass that then it's very hard to plant into, hard to just like break through that root mass to put a seedling in the ground. So yeah, we've experimented with various ways to do that. Hand trowels can be a little laborious, or we sometimes use a broad fork oriented parallel to the bed as a dibbler, because then you just push that in, and the spikes are every 4 inches, so you can do whatever spacing you want, multiples of 4 inches. I think another idea this year, our rye was so intense, even with that, it was taking a really long time to plant into. So one idea I got, which I haven't followed through on yet, is those tree seedling transplanters from the forestry industry. I've just seen videos of them, but those really open up a hole and poke through fibrous root matter pretty easily. They're very heavy duty. So yeah, I don't have a link or brand or anything to throw in the chat, but I think looking into forestry products for transplanting through rye is there's something there. And then direct seeding. Yeah, direct seeding challenges are definitely real. Into rye, we are experimenting with just broadcasting, the old-fashioned way, just by hand, or with a chest spreader if you're spreading more larger areas. But we've had pretty good results with small seeded things, any brassicas, or those are, or clover, things with small seeds that fall down through the rye very well. The larger seeds don't tend to fall down as well, and the germination is poorer. But yeah, that's a great one to workshop if people have other ideas.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I feel like we still need in our scale, and I've been talking about this a lot recently, is some sort of seed drill. It's a small scale seed drill that could get into greater residue. Like I use sometimes the Jang with the double disc, but it's not quite heavy enough and not quite intense enough to get through much residue. Can get through a little bit, but not much. But that's definitely one that we need more attention to. Christine, do you have a challenge that you've been kind of working on or running into?
I have two. So I'll throw the first one out, and that is seeding carrots. I do mostly transplanting with soil blocks, in part to deal with a lot of these residue and other issues. But I can't get around that for the carrots. So that's the one where I cheat. So we'll put a layer of compost on, and then I'll fire up the BCS, and on the most shallow setting, just work that in a little bit so that the compost doesn't become this dry, crusty death zone for germinating carrots. So that's the way I've gotten around that, to trying to have a seed bed where I can seed the carrots. The other problem I have, and I had it when I was cultivating too, is quackgrass. It's in my field. It's there, and in years past, when I was still cultivating, I did the rip the Band-Aid off practice, where I tried once or twice that I fallow a field and cultivated every 2 weeks for 6 weeks in the summer, just to try to pull the roots out. And initially that looked great in fall. I planted a cover crop then in August with oats and peas and daikon radish and things like that. And the next year in spring, that was fantastic. That was the first year then that I did no-till. So I just put compost on top of that lumpy bumpy thing. I didn't have time to do any raised beds because it was a super late start to the season. So I just threw it on top and planted. And initially that looked great. And by the end of that summer, I had quackgrass again. Where I, at that point, decided, wow, this cultivating thing isn't going to get me out of the quackgrass. What I'm finding now is by not tilling, doing a bit more compost, more mulching, and then periodically smothering it with landscape fabric, it's still there, but it's the soil is beginning to let go of the quackgrass. And so that I've really shifted my thinking about it. I think that's actually the key thing, that in the past I was like, oh, I have to fight the quackgrass. And I've shifted to, I kind of almost need to ignore the quackgrass and instead think about what does my soil need, take care of my soil better. And now I'm finding that I can often just pull out the quackgrass, that the soil, my kind of heavy clay soil, is becoming looser and it's more relaxed because it's not getting beat up all the time. And so I can pull quackgrass strands out. And yes, sometimes they're a meter long, which is kind of discouraging, but I can just like with hand, like whoop, pull it out. And so I sort of see that as that's my soil saying, okay, I'm feeling better. You can have I don't need the quackgrass. I don't need to hold on to it anymore. So, and I think the biggest shift there is in my thinking, and I'm thinking more and more, I need to get out of this mind frame of fighting problems and instead thinking about how do I nurture and heal. And I think that has more broader application. I think the sort of metaphor of fighting a problem is really, really fundamentally flawed. And I notice whenever I take that approach in any facet of life, including the market garden, usually I end up losing the fight because I'm fighting.
That's great. Yeah, that's important. I always think about weeds as nature's emergency solar panels. And it's just saying like, we need some energy pumped in here. And if you just keep knocking them down, you're not learning the lesson. And so trying to figure out what nature's trying to tell you. But no, that's great. Isabel and Ryan, what are your thoughts on challenges that you've had that you're kind of working on?
Oh, we can definitely echo what Christine just said about quackgrass or twitchgrass or whatever you want to call it. This spring specifically, we had issues with grass coming into our gardens. Anyone who's ever done no-till or even just conventional tillage, you see the grass kind of coming in from wherever it is. It'll just move into your garden plots. And in the past, the way we've mitigated that is we would have actually tilled, a tiller beds with of soil that we're not actually intending to crop so that it doesn't creep in. That now feels like it was the wrong approach, obviously. But as our soil does get looser, we can pull out that twitchgrass for sure. And we find that if it's a little bit wet, it'll come out more easily. And we actually use it for teas now. It's incredibly nutritive. There's a lot of iron. There are a lot of all kinds of minerals in them. They're a fantastic thing. It kind of tastes like cucumbers if you chew on them fresh out of the soil. But yeah, I hear that. One of the things that we're seeing as a challenge is there are a lot of crops that we're not, like I mentioned at the beginning, not doing under no-till production for a few reasons. Primarily because of the methods we've been using, and those things include carrots. We have done carrots under no-till. However, we do a large amount of carrots because we do have a 4-season CSA. So our fall share, our winter share, and even some of our spring share get carrots, and obviously our summer share get carrots that were harvested in the fall when it's got that highest Brix rating. We do use, because we have so many acres under carrot production, we do use an underdigger. So obviously we're not going to use that underdigger in our no-till beds. Like that just wouldn't make any sense. So it does mean a lot of increased labor. So we've just kept our carrots and parsnip production under till. So conventional tillage. Another one that we've shied away from doing is the potatoes. I was really excited to hear Ken Lang talk about his trial with potatoes. And but yeah, I mean, potatoes, I should preface this by saying that, or preface this by saying that Ryan and I are kind of cost of production kids. We did the Wiswall thing for a number of years and kept track of all of the different cost of production for each vegetable on our farm. And potatoes were, do you remember what the cost? I mean, I remember a dozen corn was costing us $6 to grow. So it wasn't even bringing in money, but I remember potatoes being in that ballpark.
It was very high anyway. Yeah.
it was
That's
lucrative, in other words.
But we were harvesting mostly by hand at that point. And then we bought a Chechi and Magley harvester, which speeds things up a whole lot. But again, I guess it's this thing, is that okay to use a harvester when you're calling yourself no-till?
Well, it's in no-till
it's this
production.
weird-
Yeah.
It's this weird thing that we deal with. So we don't consider that no-till because we're just running a big machine through there. But it's the only thing that makes producing potatoes for us affordable. And our market loves potatoes here.
Whereas like things like onions, we're still doing them under tilled, but we know that we can, that's one crop that we would be able to transition, although our rotation is going to be a little wonky now with our conventionally tilled areas. We have done alliums under no-till using the paper pot transplanter. And yes, we don't have any issues planting into our no-till with the paper pot transplanter. So maybe it's just a soil condition thing. Maybe it's not the type of thing we would have started our no-till gardens using. These were in gardens that most of the areas where we used the paper pot transplanter were gardens that had already been transitioned. Definitely at the beginning when the soil was really hard, we were putting a lot of transplants in because that's what the soil could hold. And I remember like the first year we took the plunge using a trowel, this was a few years ago, and actually making holes and thinking, my plant's not going to survive in this. This is hard as rock, you know, but it's thriving. And somebody in the previous session, I think it was Dan in the previous session, mentioned you'd be surprised how these types of vegetable plants are actually totally happy in these kinds of environments. And we didn't have any yield issues, even though the soil felt incredibly hard, because even in conventional systems, your soil will harden. As soon as that mechanized air is gone, you've got a hard pan underneath and you've got a hard pan on the top. The one other one that I guess we know we might have an issue transitioning are cucurbits. We've done trials using cucurbits in a no-till system and using mulches and that sort of thing. And we just found that for whatever reason, they just weren't successful. It felt like even with the added nitrogen, we were having an issue and they were yielding really low. And the ones that we tried specifically were summer squash, melons, and cucumbers. So those are the challenges.
And that might be very contextual just because we don't have many heat units. So by the time, for example, winter squash, by the time it's warm enough to put them out, if we're in no-till and that soil's not heating up, or if we're mulching right away, and that's going to keep the soil kind of cooler, I think that we've really found, I just don't think there's enough heat so that we could wait till July, but then the frost would come before they're ready to harvest out.
And I also wonder if it's an aggressive root system issue. Like cucurbits don't tend to have an aggressive root system. So maybe that's what's happening too. And maybe we were just planting them in gardens that weren't ready for that type of production.
They tend to be lateral rooters, really long lateral rooters. Carrots is an interesting one. Everybody's kind of mentioned that. I'm curious, Daniel, do you want to talk about your carrot production and how you do it? I know that maybe I'll add on, but I'll let you kind of discuss yours.
Sure. Yeah. So we do everything in no-till, sort of a similar, same system. Everything rotates around the permanent beds. For carrots, we start with a layer of compost, like a seamless layer, not just a dusting that you see the soil through, but like it's a blanket. Basically, we're rolling out a compost blanket. At this point, we've put enough animal manure-based compost that we don't need any more phosphorus. So now I use it's just composted bark mulch. So just pure bark, but ground up, composted and sifted, so it's fine. And we direct seed with an earth wave right into that, the carrots. And it's not like seeding into soil. That I need to stress that you need to irrigate that a lot at first. Not a lot of volume, but a lot of frequency. You can't let that compost dry out even for a minute. So that might be irrigating it twice a day for the first few days if it's sunny out. So as soon as it germinates and those roots are down through the compost into the soil, then you actually have to irrigate less than you would otherwise. But to get it to germinate, we keep it keep it moist constantly. And we get really good success with that. We don't do any thinning. We don't do any forking. The carrots literally just pop out. You give them a little tug, they pop right out. So that's a very profitable crop for us.
Yeah, and I'll essentially second that. That's we do a thick layer of compost. We sow into that. In the spring, we don't need to worry too much about the moisture, but as we get into any sort of temperatures, even starting in April in Kentucky, if that soil dries out at all, like Daniel said, you lose your carrots. And a couple of things that we've done to mitigate that germination loss is flipping tarps on with their white side up, holds in the moisture, so get the buds really wet. Put the tarp down, white side up. As soon as you see a germ under there, pull the tarps off. As long as it's at night, you don't want to pull it off and then have them go through a really hot day. But pull it off, and then that helps get really good, consistent, full germination if need be, especially in hotter times of the year. And then with the harvesting, we just pull them. There's usually on some of our new plots on our new farm, there's definitely, it's still, the soil's a little bit tight, but as it loosens up and as your layer of compost gets better, it does speed that up quite a bit. Parsnips go deep, and that one may always be kind of hard. Yeah. Is there I want to make sure, because we've got a lot of questions, I want to make sure to leave a lot of question time. Was there anything else that anybody else was talking about, one of their challenges that one of the other panelists may want to comment on? And you're not obliged to, of course. Let me jump over to the questions. Hold on, let me find my document here real quick. It seems to have disappeared on me. Give me 1 second. There we go. It's coming up. So let's just kind of start at the top here. Isabella and Ryan, you mentioned using the paper pot transplanter without tilling. And you also mentioned that it works pretty well in your system. Do you have any tips or thoughts or any insight to add there?
Yeah, so we just put on a lot of compost. And then similar to what Daniel was saying, you have to water that a fair amount afterwards. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's a bit rough. Sometimes the pots, you have to go back and bury them a little bit. But we did it with leeks and onions, beets,
chard.
Yep, chard this year. It's a pretty sturdy machine. We have the TerraTech one. It's a sturdy machine, and it's got a lot of weight to it. So we found it to be quite good. I tend not to broad fork before using it. Our soil gets a bit clumpy and heavy. I'm looking forward to in the future that not being the case, but when you broad fork, you kind of gets bumpy like that. That can really mess snag the paper pot transplanter up. But yeah, I found just compost and accepting that it's not going to be perfect, but you'll probably get stretches of 30 or 40, 50 feet that are great. And then you might get 10 feet that aren't so good, and then it will probably go back to good again.
Yeah, and I didn't see any loss in productivity compared to when we did it by hand either. In terms of the onions and stuff, our yield was just as good.
Yeah, so it drags through fairly well.
And I would say too, initially, I did say earlier that like the way I kind of see no-till beds is when you're in transition, you kind of want to take your time and be patient. But even saying that, the beets, when we use the paper pot transplanter this year, it was in a transition garden, a garden that was in transition into no-till. So even in that case, although we did cover crop it pretty extensively last year, I think we did a summer and a fall crop in that case. And for the cover crops, because we kind of take a big chunk of like one plot out of production at a time, we do use, an implement on the tractor, a roller crimper. Yeah, I don't know if that's the reason why it was good enough to use a paper pot transplanter on, but it worked for us.
Yeah, that's great. And then for the uninitiated, a paper pot transplanter is essentially a cell trays that are all linked together. So they're made of paper. You fill the trays with compost or with soil mix, plants. You put your seeds in there to get them started, and then you just use a contraption that draws them out, just in case there's anyone that it doesn't know what that is, and then you can just plant them in one long chain. It speeds up the transplantation process. Does anybody have any thoughts on the impact of using silage tarps on your soil?
I have one, and I basically use it to keep my compost area moderately weed free. So I have it spread out where I'm going to move my compost next, so that's not one giant mess. I don't use it really on my plots, primarily because it doesn't let water through, and so I prefer the landscape fabric because it lets water through, and I'm not dealing with a dry mess underneath it. I think that's one of the things that this past spring, when we had a incredibly dry spring, May and June were truly frightening. And it was a moment when I was really relieved that I had already made the transition to no-till, because my soil was still moist. And the stuff that I planted later in June, like those first succession plantings for my timing, when everything else was dry beyond words, stuff that was still covered with landscape fabric was actually so moist that when we transplanted into it, we didn't even have to irrigate that day to keep things alive, because the landscape fabric lets water in, but then I guess we're not getting a lot of evaporation out. Whereas with the silage tarp, it's probably a really effective, like, kind of brutal kill method if you have some really awful perennial weed problems, if you can leave it on for a long time, just because besides not letting any light in, it's also just going to deprive things of moisture completely. But I think that's also a problem.
Anyone else on silage tarps?
We have them, and I have to agree with Christine. I mean, they're not our go-to. It's not an ideal. Ideally, we're putting a cover crop in. We do use them though. I think there are two instances. One is if I just know I'm not going to have time to get to a block of beds and I can see a weeds coming in. It takes us not too long to put one on there, whereas no-till dealing with 12 beds or something in an hour takes a long time to keep weeds down. And then the other case that we'll use them is if I do see perennial weeds coming in. I like to do that. And also late season, sometimes we're pulling carrots and there's not time enough or warmth in the soil to get a cover crop germinated. I'd rather put something on it for the winter than to just leave it without anything there. So, and then that also here warms those initial beds up really quickly in the spring, as opposed to, but you do want to get it off before too long. So get that soil warmed up.
I've actually been a little bit disappointed with the silage tarps. We were told to use it as a method to transition from till into no-till, or to transition beds that were, or parts of the field that were in, sort of like a, what do you call that, a hay crop or something like that, into a vegetable production crop. And the areas, like for instance, this year we built a new greenhouse, we put the silage tarp down. I think it was down for 2 years. You'd think, okay, well, the seed bank got drawn out and there's nothing there left. But in fact, I have found it to be kind of a poor substitute as a weed suppressant agent for transition. And also, you know, most of the time I can't move it by myself. So all of a sudden you have to have 2 people moving it. If it's got any amount of water on it, it is a slimy, disgusting, heavy mess. And no one wants that. No one wants that.
Great. Yeah. There's also, I mean, obviously, I think perhaps one of the questions that definitely has to be addressed is it's a lot of plastic, and there are benefits to it. You can use it to really speed up photosynthesis, maximize your photosynthesis, but it also comes with that other negative side. I want to kind of jump to something else kind of in that vein, though, the landscape fabric questions. And if anybody has anything else they want to add on that, feel free at any point. But there's a lot of landscape fabric questions. And especially when it comes to things like quackgrass or something like this, Christine was talking about earlier, having landscape fabric can be really effective. So Cheyenne Sundance, presumably of Sundance Harvest, great person to follow. Would love to learn if anyone uses landscape fabric. We have 1.3 acres, maybe a third of in field production, and 1.3 acres of field production, and there's is just a bunch of thistle and makes 0 sense to weed regularly. She tried landscape fabric last year with holes burned, and it was night and day. So do you have any comments or thoughts on landscape fabric?
We
Anybody want to
definitely,
jump in there? Okay.
yeah, we definitely use it in mostly in our tunnel production. Obviously, long season crops, like tomatoes, for instance, has kind of been a game changer for us in those environments. But in terms of the no-till field production, we don't really see the point to it. I did see someone comment that they use it the same way we used to use tillage around our garden beds to make sure that that grass doesn't creep in. I could definitely see the use for it in that instance. I've also seen, we visited a few farms from the area a while back, and I saw somebody use landscape fabric. I think they got this from someone else. It might have been Jean Martin, but instead of putting holes into it, they would actually use it in the walk path. And so if their crop, it was 2 rows per bed, then they measured the distance between that last row and the row in the next bed, and they would just lay it down in the middle. I know for us, like it's pretty costly to get wood chips, and we don't have a lot of trees on the property. I am thinking eventually to do coppice crops, maybe with some of the things like the tag alders that are growing. But in the interim, like I can see that in the field as a good issue against walk paths. But weed management in no-till is way different than in till. The types of weeds that you're going to get are totally different, especially when you start going into 2-3 years for more in no-till management. You start seeing more of those weeds that are coming from really deep into the soil. And so like I don't think that we've seen sow thistle in our no-till bits for sure. Mm-hmm. But other
they're
types of no, and they're not that bad. And usually because the soil's gotten so loose, you can just yank them out. So if that's the reason why you're using landscape fabric, then I would say maybe it's not necessary. But yeah, in the tunnels, we definitely use it. So
I think they are helpful for transition,
mm-hmm.
Because it can be laborious if you're used to using a rototiller. But the further you get in, the less I think you need it, and it does actually save you time to not use it eventually.
I think it's a mental thing too. If the landscape fabric is going to be your way into no-till, then use it. Anything that gets you into that mode of thinking and gets you, less and less afraid of not having to rototill, then, use that as your crutch. Why not?
Yeah, and it's a great like kind of occultation in place thing, especially when you're establishing a new plot. You're essentially growing, and then you're occultating around those plants. So you're getting rid of some of that weed bank. The one thing that you kind of touched on with weeds is that weeds germinate at really shallow depths, especially things like pigweed. They really don't need anything. And that's why if you use like a power harrow or something, even super light to kill a round of pigweed, it just comes back is they need light to germinate, and they don't need very much depth. So that's one of the reasons that makes those kind of things challenging. And that's why we try and reduce our tillage. They also had questions just about both Teresa and Cheyenne and Sophie Foster. They kind of were all having a little bit of a conversation about landscape fabric, but curious about fertility in a system where you're kind of relying heavily on landscape fabric. Does anybody have any thoughts on how to manage your fertility and still make that both efficient, but also be able to use the landscape fabric?
So I don't actually grow anything in landscape fabric. I use it in between and around. So I'll use it before and after crops. And if I have a succession in spring and then something in fall coming in that bed, depending on the bed, if it's grassy or something like that, then I'll put it in for a couple weeks in between the crops as well. And I'm aware that like a couple weeks is not going to solve my quackgrass problem, but it'll set it back and give the crop a chance ahead. And at this point, what I did this past year also, because I don't use it so much during the growing season, I had it around the edges of all my blocks to minimize the grass invasion. And it's also much easier in terms of accessing the blocks for harvest, because I could just walk on that instead of through a foot of grass that otherwise would need to be mowed every week. So I've kind of used it like that. And then when crops are finished in the autumn and it's perhaps too late to establish a cover crop, and there isn't much crop residue, then I'll prioritize those beds to be covered with landscape fabric just to protect them over the winter, or any areas that are more grassy so that I can have a bit of setback for the grass then. But I think like Isabel, I see it as a crutch or a band-aid, and hope that long term I can really minimize that plastic use, though it is a really helpful tool for now.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to maybe just add to this is that you can pull half the landscape fabric, just pull the long side over, flip it over, fertilize if you have to, and then pull it back. Faithful Farms is a really good one to follow. He uses landscape fabric really creatively. And one of the things that he'll do is he has the holes in the middle of the landscape fabric, and he'll cut the plants out. Let's say he does a lot of dandelion green, so that's one that will regrow really easy. And he'll just shift the whole landscape fabric down a little bit, and then just plant into those same holes. But that essentially doesn't allow for those dandelion greens to come back, because things like charred dandelion greens, these are really easy. They get a lot of regrowth. So yeah, he moves those landscape fabrics down. So that can be an option too. Bed sizes, I think this is an interesting question from Old McDonald's farm, family farm. If you were constructing new beds, what size would you make your permanent beds? He knows that I have played with larger beds this season. I'm curious of the group's thoughts. And I also thought Daniel mentioned intercropping, and maybe he could touch on that a little bit, just how that plays into, he has 42-inch beds, and I went up to 48-inch largely because of the intercropping and the space potential.
Totally, yeah. I mean, the wider your beds, the more plantable space you have per acre, right? Because less space is used up by a path. So it's a balance of that efficiency versus the ergonomics of being able to reach the middle of the bed. So it's really a personal question, I think, and maybe also like, how tall are you and how much do you want to lean over? I'm 6'4", so 42-inch beds was an easy decision for me. But I totally get the 30-inch bed ergonomic argument. But yeah, like Jesse's saying, the more space you have, the more creative you can get with interplantings. 2, 3, however many crops in a bed. So that's another reason to maybe push it a little wider. I'd say whatever you choose, just stick with that throughout the farm, because I really am a fan of the standardization. I'd say one downside of the 30-inch bed is summer squash. To me, that's too tight to go every bed, and too far away to go every other bed. So to me, 42 inches is kind of as small as I would go for summer squash and zucchini.
Yeah, and I mean the addition of bedded surface is quite a lot. Like it's good to do the math to just look at how much bed surface you're losing and how much pathway more management you're going to have to do. If you don't have a good pathway management system, it just means you're going to have to do more of that. And another thing, the wider your beds get, the wider your pathways need to get, because you will increasingly need to be facing perpendicular to the bed when you're transplanting off of your knees or harvesting or something like that, to reach all the way into the middle of 48 inches from your side. If you're standing parallel to the bed, is really difficult. Did anybody else have anything to add on bed widths?
I really like the 5-foot centers in my paths. They sort of have varied between 1 foot and 1.5 foot. It kind of varies depending on how I put my harvest boxes in the end. And read the Fortier book after I had already started and was like, oh, maybe this wasn't such a good idea, but decided to stick with it, and really do also like it for the versatility in terms of crop spacing. And I'm getting more and more into, again, intercropping on the bed. I do definitely intercrop my blocks. That, for example, my tomato block, I have 18 beds that I have in annual crops now in each block. And then I do every other bed in tomatoes, which means that in the end, they're 10 feet apart, the rows. And then if they're well pruned and trellised, plus straw mulch, that really has so far been sufficient in terms of fungal and disease issues, because there's enough airflow there that things are dry and okay. With the wider beds, with doing more intercropping, at this point, that has enough space that I can do 2 rows of brassicas like cabbage, and then a row of leek down the middle of that. And it's a sufficient space for that kind of thing to work. And I was started doing more of that again this year after having tried intercropping on the bed like my first year, and it was this giant disastrous mess, and then I really backed away from it for a long time. But now I'm feeling up to the challenge again and really into it. And I think the bigger bed gives me that space. And I think because so many of our crops as market gardeners, from my understanding, are non-mycorrhizal, like the brassicas and the chenopod's don't play nicely with the fungi. I grow a lot, especially of the brassicas. So if I want to keep my mycorrhizal fungi happy in the soil, besides intercropping on the block, so that I always have just one bed of brassicas, and then to either side of that is something else, I also want to get mycorrhizal crops on those brassica beds, just to, maybe the fungi aren't thriving because they don't have enough roots that are feeding them, but at least they have some roots that are still playing with them. So I think having space for intercropping is really a reason to do that, and something I'm looking forward to doing much more in coming years.
Great. So speaking of diseases, since you mentioned it there, crop residue, when a crop residue has a disease, say powdery mildew, Sasha's asking about removing it. What's best way to remove it? You know, are you letting the soil digest that? What's your take on crop diseases and management post before the next crop?
I can jump in there. I believe that crop rotation and soil health is enough to manage disease. So I just flail mow, whatever disease was there, I just flail mow it, leave it there. And, the next planting is not going to be something that disease would be, that would be a host for that disease. So I think by the time a year or 2, 3 years later, it comes around to something that would be a host, that disease has long been digested by the soil. That's my take. I don't worry about sterilization and removal of diseased residues.
Daniel, there's a question from Tessa here. When do you plant the rye for overwintering? What's the latest you can plant? And
yeah, I'm in
they say they're in the same zone as you.
Oh, same zone. Yeah. So in zone 4B, October 1st is my latest, is my cutoff date for that. This year we could have gone later, but this was a weird year. So yeah, by the end of September. And I think there was another question, what the seeding rate was. I think it's about 1.5 pounds of rye seed per bed, per 42-inch bed. And our beds are 5 feet on center, so that leaves 18 inches for the paths. I think I just hit 3 questions all at once.
And you're using the Earthway to seed that, right? Do you have a plate preference?
Yeah, I use the beet plate on the Earthway, and we do, I think, 12 rows per bed. So it's pretty dense. And
there's actually a couple more. I think a lot of people are interested in the cover crops. Daniel, the additional amendments in your crimped rye system. Are you, let's say that you've crimped a rye, you're getting ready to put in a big feeder. Is there anything that you're doing there to amend the soil? And how are you doing?
Yeah, I guess that gets similar to that question about the landscape fabric, but how do you get fertility into the soil? I think that's a great general question for no-till, because the soil test results always say, like, add this much fertilizer and till in well, but we don't get to do that. So yeah, we planting into rye, if it's a heavy feeder, we'll add just some into the transplant hole as we transplant. Some organic, mostly nitrogen fertilizer is what we have to add at this point, maybe a little potassium. But yeah, the harder is if we need to add fertility before a direct seeded crop. In that case, we would spread it on the bed and then add a thin layer of that bark mulch over it. That's our incorporation, is to just bury it in a layer of mulch.
Yeah, that's often been a big question, is how to get in a no-till system, how are you adding your amendments? And you, in my experience, has been that you need them less, so it's not as big of you're not needing to add them as much. But yeah, if you're dibbling, you have the holes that you can add it to. If you're direct seeding, especially baby greens, you can add it to the surface, and your seeder is going to kind of work it in a little bit for you. Yeah, that is a little bit more complicated, and you can also use more foliars and that sort of thing as well. Let's see, where do we want to go next? This is another question on the cover crops. Have you seen allelopathic effects on the crops that you're planting into the crop? Brian, for the uninitiated, allelopathic, the reason that people love rye is that it will help to manage weeds because it puts out a chemical root exudate that suppresses weed seed germination, but can also suppress other plants. So have you seen any ill effects of that?
I haven't. We mostly transplant into it, so I guess that would bypass that effect. But I have done some experimenting, just direct seeding by hand into the rye, and I haven't noticed. I guess it's hard to tell what is causing bad germination, but we have gotten really good germination doing that. I think maybe that week under the tarp helps to maybe some of that effect is already dissipating after that. I don't know, but I haven't noticed that as a real obvious problem.
Daniel, you're crimping it, right? You're actually terminating the rye. So in that case, perhaps it's just a question, because we've noticed it too, but perhaps it's just a question of the plant's no longer alive, so it's no longer giving off that from its roots, that chemical from its roots.
Yeah. My sense is if you let rye get mature when it wants to die anyway, and then you just knock it down, my sense is there's less, maybe the allelopathic effect is less at that point, but.
There's a question here about using mulch in combination with tarps. And I don't know if maybe S. William Barents wants to add to this, but is there any time in which you're adding maybe a mulch on top of something and a tarp, or maybe even using mulch instead of a tarp or anything like that? Like, is there any combinations there that are that you think would be relevant?
I know that one person was asking, is it possible to be no-till and plastic free? And I thought that was a really interesting question, but I guess that's kind of the same thing, right? They're doing the same thing. A mulch is supposed to cover your soil, which traps the moisture, which reduces the weed pressure. I mean, it's just a different form of mulch, right? So it's whatever you have accessible. You could, in our case, getting spray-free straw is a huge issue. We have tons of conventional crops around us. When we dropped our certification a few years ago because we do direct marketing and we no longer felt the need to have it. But when we did, we had to have the farmer sign an affidavit saying that the crop had not been sprayed. It was 60 days prior to harvest. Yeah, I think so, yeah. So that was really hard to get, surprisingly, because a lot of people use glyphosates or desiccants to knock down the crop before they harvest it. So it's not too green, right? They want it to be nice and dry to be able to combine it. So, I mean, if you have access to that straw, or if you want to grow, small grains yourself, and then you can harvest your own straw and you can make sure it doesn't have anything weird sprayed on it, then by all means. I think for us, the reason why we haven't been using, or the reason why we have been using the plastic is because it's actually surprisingly more accessible to us than other options of mulches, but it basically does the same thing.
Yeah, that's a great question about plastic and no-till. And we on our farm are increasingly moving away from plastic. We haven't used any landscape fabric on this new farm. We still use the silage tarps because we're still building new beds, but those will slowly go out, and we're using flail mower techniques, and also hay is one. It's in our slow rotation plot that we can use to help mat that down and kill some of that cover crop. So we're using those things to kind of work away from plastic. It's absolutely possible, but it's also one of those things that can be really helpful in the beginning, and then you can work away from it. I think, it's good to sort of, keep those dogmas in check, just so that you're having effective production, and you're not putting yourself and your financial situation at risk. And using those tools really thoughtfully. So yeah, those are some initial thoughts. Anybody want to add? If anyone
Yeah,
wants to
I'll
add
chime
to
in there on the dangers of purism. Like we all use plastic on our farms. Even, we have greenhouses, we have irrigation piping, we sell things in bags. So yeah, I think a plastic-free farm sounds great. I haven't seen that in this day and age. But yeah, working away, just being aware of the impact of that and making those choices intentionally, I think is important. We use, no landscape fabric, or we use silage tarps, but just to enable us to grow vigorous cover crops and flip beds faster. So for me, it's enabling us to actually, photosynthesize more than if we didn't. But covering, for long periods of time with synthetic material is not really like a direction I want to be moving toward, but rather away from.
Yeah,
I think
that's
one
great.
thing that I learned from Growing for Market magazine this year was good source of cardboard. If you were wanting a different mulch source, is bicycle stores. And as soon as I read it, I was like, score, Owen Sound has 3 bike shops. We might be small, but we've got some real enthusiastic biking community. And so I established a relationship with some of those bike stores, and they would put aside the gigantic pieces of cardboard that the bikes come in that aren't covered in color and plastic. And those are a really awesome source of mulch. So if you have a bike store, within a reasonable distance, see if you can chat them up. Otherwise, they just have to haul that stuff to the next recycling facility. But that's a really, I think, viable at this scale sort of source of cardboard. Anybody living in Owen Sound, please don't do that. I already talked to Scenic City Cycle. You'll have to find a different bike store.
That's great. There's a question, Daniel, have you ever tried using the paper pot transplanter? This person, Ryan, is suggesting, do you think you could modify the paper pot transplanter by added weight and possibly cutting blade to transplant into rye?
Into rye, I doubt it. I think you would need something more mechanized. I think to have the cutting power to go through rye, you'd need the horsepower to be able to pull that. So that might stop being a human scale at that point. To be able to just like glide through that root mass would, I think I would need like coulters or like cutting discs, opener discs or something pulled by something bigger than a human. I think, the paper pot planter is hard enough even on just like after a previous, salad green crop or whatever, that doesn't have a fibrous root mass. So with that, I think, adding more compost on top, like the others said, would be the way to go with paper pot. Personally, I'm not that excited about paper pot because I love the act of pushing plants into the ground with hands. There's something sacred about that for me. But I totally get it. It is a very efficient tool.
Let's see, for direct seeding cover crops into permanent raised beds, can you tell us some of you said the rates earlier. We actually covered that one. Okay, so some favorite intercrops. Does everybody want to, I actually maybe start with Isabel and Ryan. I don't know that we've talked about it. And do you all do much intercropping?
We do some, obviously the easy ones like tomatoes and basil. That's a really no-brainer for us. Other than that,
we're on a 30-inch bed system, so there isn't a lot of room. Like the beds are pretty taken up. I think we're actually doing it mostly in our non-tilled gardens. We're putting flowers in as an IPM, like an integrated pest management strategy.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
In with our winter squash, we have all kinds of flowers and things going in alongside those.
Yeah, and Rob Fox had convinced us at one point to do beans in between our potato crop, and it actually worked really, really well. Though we moved away from that because from a logistics standpoint, you've got your pickers coming out and you're like, you're going to do this section and then you're going to walk all the way over there with your baskets and you're going to go do those beans. So it didn't really make sense from us from a logistics standpoint, but from an actual crop health standpoint, it worked really well.
And the other thing that we have done, that's not intercrop. Well, I guess it is intercropping, but our cover cropper is 3 earthways ganged together. And you can move them on the bar. Mm-hmm. So I've made it so, for example, if I've got scallions late into the season and I want to make sure I have a cover crop going in, I can just move the earthway so that I can drive right over those scallions when they're not too big yet, and put peas and oats down or something like that. When the scallions, just to say the earthway is not going to clip them off or damage them, and that's worked really well.
It did. Yeah.
We pulled out the scallions after, and the cover crop was already well established going into the winter. And I mean, that's really high management stuff. Like, you have to be really on the ball to nail that every time. But yeah, things like that do work.
We have found that in those no-till gardens that we end up doing a lot of succession crops, a lot more than we were with conventional methods, because all of a sudden you don't have to wait for a day to get your tiller out. The soil isn't wet the same way. Like, rainfall events won't affect no-till systems in terms of succession crops the same way that it would with conventional tillage. So we don't actually end up dedicating much time for the cover crops, ironically, in our no-till gardens. So those kinds of late season intercrops end up being key for us, because we're trying to do the majority of our cover cropping at the end of the season. We really prioritize those no-till gardens for early season because things tend to stay wet, obviously, in the spring. So we've been able to get in faster. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of diverting the question there about intercrops.
Oh, that's great. Christine or Daniel, do you want to jump in on intercropping?
Okay, I'll jump in then. So my blocks are intercropped, so I have 18 beds, and then each block has sort of a main cast of characters and then the supporting crew. So that's between beds. Within the beds, what I've been experimenting with is spring and fall brassicas with leek or green onions grown bigger to be negi onions. So I did an on-farm research project with that this year with cauliflower and negi onions, and that works pretty good because the brassicas, I have 2 rows of that, and then one row of alliums down the middle. And the sort of key challenge there is if I'm needing a row cover because of flea beetles, then the leek doesn't necessarily appreciate having that like roof on its head. So I might put wire hoops across this coming year and then put the row cover on. Another one that I've been doing more of is green onions between beets. Those are sort of the main ones that I've been doing, and really liking that, and because they fit in terms of like the architecture of the plant, and they also fit in terms of timing and harvests. So I'm not running into the kinds of issues with like potatoes and peas or beans where it becomes a real nightmare to harvest things. And most of my inspiration or guidelines for that comes from this German organic growing book first published in 1980. And they have this amazing chart in there about who likes to be with who and who doesn't like to be with who. And that's really the basis of my overall garden design in terms of what I grow beside what.
Who's the author of that book? Is that the Synergistic Biogarten? Is that what that was called? I've got you on mute too, Christine. Or you are on mute.
You're on mute, Christine.
Sorry. I'll write it into the chat. Sorry.
Okay, great.
With the title and the author.
And before we go, Daniel, you have to give us some of your interplanting favorites this year.
Sure. One of my favorites is ginger and carrots in the high tunnel. We plant them at the same time, kind of mid-spring. And the ginger takes a long time to germinate. We direct seed our ginger. We don't pre-sprout it. So the carrots come up 3 rows of carrots, 2 rows of ginger, and to kind of grow up together and just are real happy together. And then the carrots are pulled out by the time the ginger needs more space, so it works out really well. In general, outdoors, I've actually moved more from doing a lot of different intercropping experiments to more just sort of undersowing. I find the trade-off between just efficiency and simplicity and like staying on top of everything, it can be really hard with interplanting cash crops, just because the timing can be so crucial. They want different irrigation needs. Some of them want row cover, some don't. Harvesting and just keeping track of where everything is, communicating that to the crew. So those are some real challenges with interplanting. So I find we get the same soil health benefits by just undersowing a cover crop to the cash crops, or a mix of cover crops. And or something like parsley is a nice one to undersow that can be a cash crop, but we sort of treat as a cover crop. Anything that's fungal friendly, like Christine said, to feed the mycorrhizal network, keep that pumped full of exudates, and and getting the timing right for the undersowing is key. But then that can be really great, because then when the crop is done, you already have your fall winter cover crop established in the understory, and it's fills out the bed really fast in the fall. So that's I've been leaning more toward that than the sort of complexity of the 3 different cash crops all in one bed.
Well, I know we could all talk about these things forever, but our time is up, and I'm going to turn it back over to the EFAO. Thank you all. Thanks to our panels. Thank you for everyone who's come. This has been a really, really amazing conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jesse. And thanks to our panelists, Isabella, Ryan, Daniel, Christine. Is this working? Presenting?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank all our panelists and our moderator, Jesse. I want to remind everybody that you can sign up for the EFAO newsletter and watch out for our no-till meetups over this winter, so we can keep chatting together and problem solving. I also encourage you all to head over to Wander as well to keep this no-till conversation going. And some of our partners and sponsors will be there as well. The Organic Council of Ontario, Ontario Soil Network, Gintech Shade Solutions, Open Food Network, Wellington Produce Packing, and Regeneration Canada. Cassie's already launched the poll there, so thank you very much. I encourage you to fill that out. We really appreciate all your feedback on these sessions and on other things. So if you could fill that out, that would be much appreciated. And if you have any other additional comments, you can always send it to conference@efao.ca. I'd also once again, I think Wander would be a great place to continue on this conversation. If you want to talk no-till, you can head over there. Engage with us on social media. Feel free to share your conference experience. Tag us at #EFAO 2021, and please tag us. Yeah, there we go, at EFAO2. There's also, please remember to vote for the Farmer Innovation Carrot Cash Innovation Prize at the website that Cassie's going to drop into the link. We also have our online silent auction that will be closing tomorrow, Friday at 3 p.m. Lots of good things in there to go and bid on. And I think, once again, I'll just say thank you very much. Oh, there we go. Forgot to change the slide. Thank you very much to Jesse, Daniel, Christine, Ryan, and Isabella for all of your awesome comments and conversation around this topic.